Today, we are digging into a really fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty complex question that sits right at the intersection of psychology and biology. We're going to explore a proposed biological pathway that could connect our minds to cancer progression. And we're basing this all on a 2005 paper by Argaman, Gidron, and Aryad. So let's just get right to it. Here is the big, provocative idea. Can a psychological state, a feeling of being completely and utterly hopeless, actually create real, measurable changes in your body that could help a tumor grow? That's the central question we are unpacking today. Now, people have been asking this question for a long time, and the history here is a bit messy. The evidence trying to link psychology to what causes cancer in the first place, well, it's pretty inconsistent. But the idea that our mental state might influence the progression of a cancer that's already there, that's found a bit more support, though. For sure, it is still a very hot topic of debate in the scientific community. To really get into this, we have to be specific. We're not just talking about stress in some vague way. The researchers here are focused on a very particular psychological state they call helplessness, hopelessness, or HH. It's really made of two core beliefs. Number one, you feel like you have absolutely no control over what happens in your life. And number two, you just expect that whatever happens next, it's going to be bad. And this idea of helplessness actually has a pretty famous backstory in psychology. You might have even heard of it, learned helplessness. It came from these classic studies where animals were exposed to stressors they couldn't control, like inescapable shocks. And later, when they could escape, they didn't even try. They had learned to be helpless. So how in the world could a psychological state like that possibly connect to something as physical as a tumor? Well, that's where this 2005 model comes into play. The authors decided to map out a specific step-by-step biological chain of events that could potentially explain this mind-body connection. So yeah, let's dive into it. And here it is. This diagram is basically our roadmap for the next few minutes. It lays out the entire hypothesis, from top to bottom, starting with a feeling and ending up right at the cellular level. We're going to walk through this whole thing piece by piece. Okay, so right at the very heart of this whole proposed pathway is one key molecule. It's a cytokine called interleukin-1 beta, or just IL-1 beta for short. The scientists suggest that this one molecule acts like a critical messenger, carrying a signal all the way from the brain down to the tumor itself. So let's start at the top of the chain. The model's first step is forging a link between that psychological feeling of helplessness and an actual chemical change inside the brain. I mean, how does a feeling become a physical signal? Well, the evidence for this part comes from those animal studies. Research found that when rats were put through that same uncontrollable stress, the levels of IL-1 beta in their brains went up. But here's the kicker. When scientists went in and actually blocked IL-1 beta in the brain, the rats showed fewer of those learned helplessness behaviors. That's a huge clue. It suggests brain IL-1 beta isn't just a side effect. It might be directly causing or at least mediating that feeling of helplessness. Okay, so now we have a chemical signal, more IL-1 beta, in the brain. The very next step in the model is figuring out how that localized signal in the brain gets broadcast out to the entire body. The thinking is that this brain IL-1 beta kicks on the body's two main stress response systems. You've got the HPA axis, which is the one that ends with the release of the famous stress hormone, cortisol, and then you have the SAM axis, which gets the sympathetic nervous system going and releases epinephrine. You probably know it better as adrenaline. So what you end up with is that a signal that started in the brain has now gone body-wide, or systemic. The whole body is now essentially on high alert, flooded with stress hormones. And according to this model, this whole process can also lead to higher levels of IL-1 beta all throughout the body. All right, so we've gone from the mind to the brain, and from the brain to the entire body. Now we get to the final and maybe the most critical step in this whole proposed pathway. How does this stressed out environment in the body actually help cancer cells? The model proposes that IL-1 beta, which is now floating around everywhere, can promote three key processes that are basically the hallmarks of cancer getting worse. It helps cancer cells escape death, build their own blood supply, and spread to new places. Let's break each of those down. First up is escape from apoptosis. You can think of apoptosis as the body's natural quality control system. It's a programmed self-destruct sequence for any cells that are damaged or have gone rogue. This model suggests that IL-1 beta might help cancer cells just ignore those self-destruct signals, basically letting them cheat death and keep on growing.
Second,
angiogenesis. You see, for a tumor to grow beyond just a tiny little clump of cells, it needs its own blood supply to get oxygen and nutrients. IL-1 beta has been shown to trigger factors that help tumors build brand new blood vessels, kind of like creating their own personal highways to bring in supplies and fuel their expansion. And number 3 is metastasis, the part where cancer spreads, which is really the most dangerous stage. The paper explains how IL-1 beta can make both the cancer cells and other body tissues stickier by ramping up what are called adhesion molecules, and this makes it a lot easier for those cancer cells to grab on, invade, and set up new colonies in distant parts of the body. And so when you look at the complete diagram again, you can see the whole story. You can trace this plausible, though remember, still theoretical, chain of dominoes, from a psychological state to a brain chemical to a body-wide stress alert, and finally, right down to the cellular tricks that help cancer get worse. Just understanding that a pathway like this could exist is a huge first step, because it might one day help researchers find new ways to treat cancer that address both the mind and the body. And the authors themselves were very clear about what they were and were not trying to do. They said, look, we focused on IL-1 beta not because we think it's the only thing involved, but because we wanted to show that it's possible to explain this link with real biology. It's an example of how it could work. And that leads us to some really important caveats, things we have to keep in mind. First, this is a proposed model, a scientific hypothesis. It is not definitive proof. A lot of the key evidence, especially that brain stuff, comes from animal studies, and you always have to be careful translating that to humans. IL-1 beta is almost certainly just one small piece in an incredibly complex puzzle, and a lot more research is needed to connect all of these dots. But even as a hypothesis, this model is pretty powerful. It shows us that it's possible. It maps out a tangible biological route for something abstract, like a feeling, to influence our physical bodies. And it really leaves us with this one big, compelling question. Is this one pathway even possible? What other secrets is the mind-body connection hiding?